Sergeant Daniel Hayes took a deep breath as he stepped off the military transport vehicle and into the airport terminal, the weight of his duffel bag pressing heavily against his shoulder. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a stark contrast to the endless skies and barren landscapes he had grown accustomed to over the past 9 months. He had been deployed overseas in a grueling combat zone, enduring long days, restless nights, and the constant stress of never knowing what lay ahead. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, he was heading home. The thought alone sent a wave of relief through him. He could already picture his mother waiting at the airport, his younger sister holding up a handmade sign, his father standing a few feet back with that proud, knowing look in his eyes. Home. That word had kept him going through some of the toughest moments of his deployment. The promise of seeing familiar faces, of hugging his mother, of eating something that wasn't freeze-dried or vacuum-sealed. Home wasn't just a place. It was a feeling, a reminder that there was still warmth waiting for him beyond the battlefield. As he adjusted the strap on his shoulder, he exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the exhaustion that clung to his body like a second skin. He had barely slept in the last 48 hours, his body still running on the rigid discipline of military life. But now he could finally let himself relax, at least a little. The airport was busy as always. People rushed past him, their eyes glued to their phones, their hands gripping suitcases, their conversations buzzing in a dozen different languages. It was strange being back in the world, in a place where no one was scanning the horizon for danger, where the loudest sound was the announcement of boarding calls rather than the distant echo of gunfire. For a moment, Daniel felt out of place, like a ghost drifting through a world that had kept moving without him. But then he reminded himself he belonged here. He had earned this moment. His boots thudded softly against the polished floor as he made his way to the check-in counter. His uniform, crisp but slightly worn from travel, drew a few glances. Some passengers offered polite smiles. A few nodded in respect, and one elderly man placed a hand on his heart as he passed, a silent gesture of gratitude. Those small moments always meant something to Daniel. They were reminders that despite everything, the exhaustion, the sacrifices, the time away, people still cared. When he reached the airline counter, the attendant, a young woman with tired eyes but a kind smile, glanced at his uniform and immediately perked up. "Good afternoon, Sergeant. Thank you for your service." Daniel returned the smile, appreciating the gesture. "Thank you. I have a first-class ticket, courtesy of the Military Appreciation Program." The words felt surreal leaving his mouth. First class, it was a small luxury, one he had never expected but deeply appreciated. After months of sleeping on call, of eating hastily prepared meals, of moving from one mission to the next with barely a moment to breathe, the idea of sitting in a wide, comfortable seat, of stretching out his legs, of maybe even getting a few solid hours of sleep, it was almost too good to be true. The attendant nodded and printed out his boarding pass. "You're all set. Enjoy your flight, Sergeant." "Thank you." He took the ticket and made his way to security, slipping into the routine of removing his boots, placing his bag on the conveyor belt, and stepping through the scanner. It was all muscle memory at this point. When he was finally through, he let out a slow breath, feeling the tension ease slightly from his shoulders. He was one step closer to home. The gate was crowded with passengers waiting for their flights, families chatting, business travelers focused on their laptops, children tugging at their parents' hands. Daniel found a seat near the window, letting his gaze drift over the planes parked at the terminal. His thoughts wandered, memories of his deployment flickering in and out of his mind. He thought about the men and women he had served with, the friendships forged in fire, the laughter that had been shared despite the hardships. Some of them wouldn't be boarding planes home. Some of them had given everything. A pang of guilt settled in his chest. It always did. Survivor's guilt, they called it. The feeling that he didn't deserve this moment, this chance to go home when others never got the same opportunity. But he pushed the thought away. He had to. If he didn't, it would consume him. The boarding announcement snapped him out of his thoughts. First-class passengers may now board. Daniel rose to his feet, adjusting his duffel bag as he approached the gate. The flight attendant scanning tickets barely glanced at him, offering a distracted, "Welcome aboard," as she waved him through. He didn't mind. He was used to blending into the background. As he stepped onto the plane, the familiar scent of cabin air filled his lungs. The hum of the ventilation system, the neatly arranged seats, the quiet luxury of first class. It was all so different from the crowded, noisy flights he was used to. He walked down the aisle, his gaze searching for his assigned seat. And then, just as he reached it, he felt a presence step into his path. A flight attendant stood before him, her uniform pressed to perfection, her expression unreadable. She glanced at his ticket, then at him, and something in her gaze shifted. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her tone cool and dismissive. "This seat is not available for you, so." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" The flight attendant's posture stiffened, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. "You'll have to move to the back." His brows furrowed. There must be a mistake. This is my assigned seat. He held up his ticket, pointing to the first-class section clearly printed on it. "I was upgraded as part of the military appreciation program." Her lips thinned. "I understand, sir, but you'll need to take your seat in economy." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't expecting a hero's welcome, but he also hadn't expected to be dismissed so coldly. There was no explanation, no apology, just an order, as if he didn't belong here. For a moment, he considered letting it go. It was just a seat, right? But as he looked around and saw the empty first-class seats, saw the way she refused to even acknowledge his ticket, something inside him refused to back down. This wasn't about luxury. This was about respect. And Sergeant Daniel Hayes had spent too many months earning that respect to let someone take it away so easily. Sergeant Daniel Hayes had spent the last 9 months in the heart of a combat zone, surrounded by uncertainty, exhaustion, and the constant pressure of war. His body bore the weight of sleepless nights. His mind carried the ghosts of missions past, and his heart ached for the moment he could finally set foot on home soil. This flight, this ticket, was supposed to be a brief moment of comfort, a rare luxury after everything he had endured. It wasn't just a seat. It was a small acknowledgement of his sacrifice. But as he stood there in the aisle of the airplane, staring at the flight attendant blocking his way, that sense of comfort was swiftly slipping away. "I'm sorry, sir," the flight attendant said, her voice smooth yet detached. "This seat is not available for you." Daniel felt the words like a slap. His brows furrowed as he looked down at the boarding pass in his hand. Seat 2A, first class. It was printed right there in black and white. His grip on the paper tightened, his pulse picking up as a strange mix of confusion and irritation crawled under his skin. "There must be a mistake," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is my assigned seat." The flight attendant's posture stiffened. Her uniform was immaculate, her polished smile carefully practiced, but there was something in her eyes, something unreadable yet dismissive. "No mistake," she said coolly, her gaze flicking briefly to his uniform before shifting away, as if even acknowledging it was an inconvenience. "You'll have to move to the back." Move to the back. Daniel felt something deep inside him twist. For a split second, his mind took him somewhere else, back to the sweltering heat of deployment, back to the moments where he had been ordered to move without question, back to the times when he had no choice but to obey, because hesitation meant the difference between life and death. But this was not the battlefield. This was a commercial airplane, and he wasn't being asked to move for safety, for strategy, for survival. He was being asked to move because, for some reason, this woman had decided that he didn't belong in first class. A flicker of anger sparked in his chest, but he forced himself to keep his emotions in check. He had faced worse. He had been through hell and back. He could handle one rude flight attendant. With slow, deliberate movements, he lifted the boarding pass higher, tapping his finger against the seat number. "I have a first-class ticket," he repeated, his voice edged with quiet steel. "I was upgraded as part of the airline's military appreciation program." The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't care about that," she said, her voice losing its forced politeness. "You need to move." The words were dismissive, sharp, final. And just like that, something inside Daniel snapped. This wasn't about a seat anymore. This was about respect. For months, he had worn this uniform with pride, carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, fought for a country that promised to honor those who served. He had never asked for special treatment. He didn't need recognition, parades, or empty words of gratitude. But this was something else. This was a blatant refusal to acknowledge his place, his worth, his right to be treated like any other paying passenger on this flight. A silence had settled over the surrounding passengers. He could feel their eyes on him, their curiosity, their discomfort. No one spoke. No one intervened. They were waiting to see what he would do, to see if he would give in, to see if he would simply lower his gaze and walk to the back like he had been ordered. But Sergeant Daniel Hayes had spent too many years standing tall to back down now. "Let me speak with the manager," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. The flight attendant's expression darkened, but she shook her head. "No," she said bluntly. "Take your seat in the back, or you won't be seated at all." For a moment, Daniel could do nothing but stare at her. It would have been so easy to comply, to let it go, to avoid the confrontation. He was exhausted. His body ached. He just wanted to get home. But if he walked away now, what message would that send? That it was okay for people like him, people who had fought, bled, and sacrificed, to be treated as less than? No, not today. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his shoulders, his military training kicking in. If there was one thing he had learned in the service, it was how to stand his ground. "I am asking to speak with the manager," he said again, this time louder, clearer. The weight of command in his voice was unmistakable. "Now." Passengers murmured, shifting in their seats. The energy in the cabin had changed. The tension had thickened. People were paying attention now. The flight attendant hesitated, a flicker of something, doubt perhaps, crossing her features. But she still refused to move, still refused to acknowledge the growing discomfort in the room. Then, from somewhere behind him, a voice spoke up. "He has a first-class ticket," a woman said firmly. "You can't just send him to the back." Another voice followed. "Yeah, that doesn't seem right." The ripple effect had begun. Daniel's chest tightened, not with anger, but with something else, something unfamiliar yet grounding. It wasn't just about him anymore. Other passengers had seen what had happened. They had watched the way he had been treated, and they weren't willing to let it slide. The flight attendant's face paled slightly. She glanced toward the front of the cabin, as if looking for an escape. And then, finally, as the murmurs grew louder, the door at the front of the plane opened, and the manager stepped inside. Daniel exhaled slowly. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as he met the manager's gaze, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving without a fight. Sergeant Daniel Hayes had been through worse. He had survived grueling deployments, witnessed the kind of destruction that hardened men, and stood in places where fear was a constant companion. But this moment, this simple, almost ridiculous confrontation over a seat on an airplane felt different. It wasn't the battlefields of a foreign country. It wasn't life or death. And yet, the sting of humiliation burned deep. He had expected nothing more than a moment of comfort, a chance to close his eyes and let exhaustion take him. A small reward after months of service, of sacrifice. But here he was, standing in the aisle of an airplane, feeling like an outsider in a place he had every right to be. "I have a valid first-class ticket," Daniel repeated, gripping the boarding pass a little tighter. His voice was controlled, steady, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him. "I was upgraded as part of the military appreciation program." The flight attendant's lips curled into a thin, unimpressed line. Her gaze flickered over his uniform, a glance so brief yet so telling. She didn't see the long months he had spent overseas, the nights spent awake listening for danger, the moments of fear and courage intertwined. She didn't see the blood, the sweat, the relentless exhaustion. No, she just saw a man in uniform, an inconvenience, a problem to be dismissed. "I don't care about that," she said flatly. The words were like ice water down his spine. Something inside Daniel cracked. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the way she said them, cold, uncaring, as if his service meant nothing, as if the sacrifices he and so many others had made weren't even worth a second thought. He had always been told to stay humble, to never expect special treatment, and he never had. But this wasn't about special treatment. This was about being treated like a person, like a paying passenger, like someone who mattered. She crossed her arms, shifting her weight slightly, and, "Like I said, you need to move. Move. Go to the back." The words echoed in his head, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Small, disposable, a nuisance. He had spent years carrying the weight of duty, of responsibility, of standing tall so others could feel safe. And yet here, in this moment, he felt powerless. His grip tightened on the boarding pass, his fingers curling around the edges. He could feel his pulse in his ears, steady but rising. He wasn't angry, no. Anger would have been easier. This was something deeper, a feeling he couldn't quite name. He glanced around, searching the faces of nearby passengers. Some looked uncomfortable, their gazes darting away quickly, unwilling to be involved. Others whispered among themselves, their eyes bouncing between him and the flight attendant. No one spoke up. No one said, "Hey, he has a ticket." No one challenged what was happening. He was alone, just like that night, the night his convoy had been hit. Daniel's breath hitched just slightly. It had been a routine patrol. They had done everything right. But war didn't care about routines. It didn't care about training or discipline or how good you were at your job. The explosion had come out of nowhere, tearing through the night, filling the air with fire and metal and screams. He remembered the heat, the panic, the moment his world flipped. He remembered dragging his friend, his brother in arms, out of the wreckage, his uniform soaked in blood that wasn't his own. He had survived. He had carried that night with him every single day since. And yet, standing here, being dismissed so easily, so callously, felt like a different kind of wound. The kind that cut deeper than shrapnel. He cleared his throat, forcing himself back to the present. "I'd like to speak with the manager." The flight attendant's eyes narrowed slightly, irritation flickering across her face. She let out a short breath, shaking her head. "I already told you I'm not moving," Daniel cut in, his voice lower now, firmer. She blinked, surprised by the shift in his tone. A murmur rippled through the nearby passengers. Daniel took a step forward, just enough to make his presence known, but not enough to be aggressive. "I fought for this country. I served so people like you could work jobs like this, in a country that's safe because of the men and women who wear this uniform." He held up the ticket again. "And now, after all of that, you're telling me that I don't deserve to sit in the seat I was assigned?" The flight attendant's lips parted, but she hesitated. Something flickered in her expression. Uncertainty, maybe. For a moment, he thought she might reconsider, might back down. But then, as if snapping back into her authority, she squared her shoulders. "You're causing a scene," she said sharply. Daniel let out a humorless laugh. A scene? A scene was what he had seen in the deserts overseas. A scene was what happened when chaos erupted, when lives hung in the balance, when the air smelled of burning metal and the ground shook beneath your feet. This was nothing, but it was about to be something. Because suddenly from a few rows back, a voice spoke up. "This is wrong." Daniel turned, as did several passengers. An older woman, mid-60s, silver hair, soft but sharp eyes, stood up. She wore a simple cardigan, a pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. "My husband was in the military," she said, her voice strong, "and I know how much soldiers give. This man has a first-class ticket. You can't just push him aside like he doesn't matter." The tension in the cabin shifted, and then another voice. "This isn't right," a younger man, maybe in his 30s, added. "I saw his ticket. He's supposed to be here." More murmurs. The flight attendant's face paled slightly. Daniel stood taller. For the first time since stepping onto this plane, he wasn't alone. And as the voices of the passengers grew louder, as people began to demand answers, the flight attendant's composure began to crack. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because Daniel Hayes wasn't just fighting for his seat, he was fighting for his dignity. And he wasn't leaving until someone gave him the respect he had earned. Sergeant Daniel Hayes had spent years following orders, standing in formation, marching into danger without hesitation. But today, here in the narrow aisle of a commercial airplane, it wasn't bullets or bombs he was facing. It was indifference. Cold, calculated indifference that wrapped around him like chains, tightening with every passing second. The flight attendant's dismissive tone still echoed in his ears. "I don't care about that. You need to move." Her words had sunk into his chest, settling there like a lead weight. He had expected resistance in combat, expected obstacles on the battlefield. But never had he expected to come home, Step onto a flight meant to carry him back to peace and be treated like he didn't belong. This was about more than a seat now. This was about respect. His grip on the boarding pass tightened, the edges crinkling under his fingers. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some wary, others curious. But none of them spoke. They simply watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel took a steady breath, forcing his emotions under control. "I'd like to speak with the manager," he said, his voice even, but carrying the sharp edge of command. The flight attendant's lips twitched in irritation, but she didn't move. "I already told you, sir, this seat isn't available to you. I'm asking again." He squared his shoulders, standing tall, unyielding. "I want to speak with the manager." Now, for the first time, something flickered in her expression. Annoyance, hesitation. But then just as quickly, it was gone. "You're holding up the boarding process," she snapped, glancing toward the passengers behind him, as if to use them as a weapon against him. "Other people need to take their seats. We need to keep things moving." A murmur rippled through the cabin, but no one dared to intervene. Daniel clenched his jaw, his patience thinning like a frayed rope. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He wasn't demanding anything unreasonable. He had a first-class ticket, one that had been given to him as a small token of gratitude for his service. But this woman had decided that he didn't deserve it. And why? Because of his uniform? Because of some personal bias she refused to admit? Or was it simply because she thought she could get away with it? Daniel wasn't sure which answer angered him more. "Look," he said, keeping his voice calm despite the fire burning in his chest. "I don't know what the issue is, but I have a valid ticket. I've served this country. I don't need a parade. I don't need applause. But I do need to be treated with the same respect as every other paying customer on this flight." For a second, the flight attendant hesitated. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her uniform. But then, just as quickly, she hardened. "I have nothing else to say to you, sir," she said coldly. "Please move to the back of the plane." The dismissal hit harder than it should have, like a gunshot without the sound. Daniel felt his pulse thunder in his ears. The words brought back memories he had spent years trying to bury, moments where he had been told to move without question, to obey without hesitation. Only this time there was no mission, no life on the line, just an airline employee who had decided in an instant that he didn't belong. Something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to let this happen. Not today, not to him, not to any soldier who came after him. Stepping forward, he lifted his chin, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the murmuring passengers around him. "I am demanding to speak to the manager." The energy in the cabin shifted. Passengers turned their heads. A few exchanged glances. A woman in business attire leaned forward, her brow furrowed. A young man pulled out his phone as if considering recording the moment. For the first time, Daniel saw it. The flicker of doubt in the flight attendant's eyes. She knew she was losing the control, and that was when the intercom crackled to life. A voice, clear, professional, spoke over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We will be resolving a passenger concern momentarily." Moments later, the cabin door at the front of the plane swung open, and a man in a neatly pressed airline uniform stepped inside. His silver name tag gleamed under the cabin lights. The manager. Daniel's chest tightened. Finally. The flight attendant's posture stiffened, her arms folding tightly across her chest. But she said nothing as the manager approached. "Sir," the manager said, his voice smooth but guarded, "I understand there's been an issue with your seat assignment." Daniel exhaled slowly, controlling the storm inside him. "Yes," he said firmly, "there has. I was upgraded to first class as part of your military appreciation program. I have a valid ticket. But your employee has refused to let me sit in my assigned seat." The manager's eyes flickered toward the flight attendant. Her expression was tight, defensive. For the first time since this had started, Daniel saw something new, panic. She knew she had pushed too far. The manager turned back to Daniel, his professional mask never slipping. "May I see your boarding pass?" Without hesitation, Daniel handed it over. The manager studied it for a moment. Then he looked back at the flight attendant. His expression didn't change, but his voice carried a weight that made her flinch. "This ticket is valid," he said simply. A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers held their breath. The flight attendant's face paled, her lips parting as if searching for an excuse. But I thought, you thought wrong, the manager cut in, his voice edged with quiet authority. Daniel watched as the woman swallowed hard, her hands clenching at her sides. For the first time, she seemed to realize what was happening. She wasn't just losing this battle, she had lost. The manager turned back to Daniel, nodding. I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding, Sergeant Hayes. Please, take your seat. Daniel let out a slow breath. It wasn't just a victory, it was validation. He nodded, stepping past the stunned flight attendant, finally taking the first-class seat he had been denied. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. A few passengers nodded in approval. And as Daniel settled in, the young man with the phone lifted it slightly, offering a subtle thumbs up before putting it away. Daniel exhaled, letting his body relax for the first time in what felt like hours. This wasn't just about him. It was about every soldier, every veteran, every person who had ever been dismissed, disrespected, and made to feel like they were less than. And today, he had made sure that wouldn't happen. Not here, not now, and not ever again. Sergeant Daniel Hayes sat stiffly in his seat, his body still coiled with frustration. The injustice of it all burned in his chest like a fire that refused to die down. He had done everything right. He had followed protocol, remained respectful, and asked for nothing more than what was rightfully his. And yet, here he was, being treated like an inconvenience, like he was the problem. The plane had landed, but the battle wasn't over. Not yet. As passengers slowly gathered their belongings and shuffled toward the exit, Daniel remained seated, his eyes locked on the front of the cabin where the airline supervisor had arrived, standing in hushed conversation with the flight attendant who had denied him his first-class seat. The same woman who had looked down at him with an air of indifference. The same woman who had crossed her arms and told him, without so much as a second thought, that he didn't belong. And now she stood there with an expression that was far too composed, far too comfortable. Daniel clenched his jaw. Was she going to get away with this? A moment later, the airline manager turned toward him, his expression smooth, his posture relaxed, as if this was just another minor inconvenience in his otherwise routine day. Sergeant Hayes, the manager began, his voice overly polished, rehearsed. I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding that may have occurred today. Daniel's blood ran cold. Misunderstanding? His fingers curled into fists against his thighs. It wasn't just the word, it was the way the manager had said it, the way he had smoothed over the situation as if it were nothing, as if Daniel had simply misheard the flight attendant, as if his frustration, his humiliation, the blatant disrespect he had endured had all been in his head. Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. I don't believe there was a misunderstanding, he said, his voice even but firm. She told me the seat wasn't available. She dismissed my request without checking. And when I asked for the manager, she refused. That's not a misunderstanding. That's intentional. The manager's polite mask faltered for a brief second before snapping back into place. Well, he said, adjusting his tie, we take all customer concerns very seriously and will be reviewing this matter internally. Daniel's patience was hanging by a thread. He had heard lines like this before. Empty words, corporate deflections designed to pacify complaints without ever addressing them. This wasn't about an internal review. It was about making the issue disappear, and he wasn't going to let them. I want to know what actions are being taken, Daniel pressed. The manager hesitated, his polished demeanor cracking ever so slightly. As I said, Sergeant, this will be handled appropriately. He didn't like that answer, not one bit. Daniel let out a slow, measured breath, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. What does appropriately mean? He asked, his voice edged with steel. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're just trying to brush this under the rug. The manager's jaw tightened. He didn't expect pushback. He was used to people accepting vague apologies and moving on. Daniel wasn't moving on. Not this time. There was a moment of silence, the tension in the air thick and unrelenting. A few passengers lingering nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. Then the flight attendant, the very woman who had started all of this, finally spoke. I didn't do anything wrong, she muttered under her breath. Daniel turned to her, his gaze sharp. You didn't do anything wrong, he repeated, his voice quiet but firm. You denied me my seat without checking. You dismissed me. You refused to call the manager. And when it became clear that you were wrong, you still refused to acknowledge it. Her face twisted slightly, as if she was trying to hold on to whatever thin justification she had left. For the first time since this had started, doubt flickered in her expression. But she still didn't apologize. She wouldn't. And that said everything. Daniel turned back to the manager. So I'll ask again, what actions are being taken? The manager let out a slow breath. Sergeant, if I don't get a real answer, Daniel interrupted, I'll be making a formal complaint. And I won't stop until this is addressed properly. The manager's shoulders tensed. He knew what that meant. A formal complaint from a service member wasn't just a bad look, it was a PR nightmare. Finally, after a long moment, the manager sighed and nodded. The flight attendant will be placed under review. I'll personally be reporting this to senior leadership. Daniel studied him carefully. Placed under review? He repeated. Another corporate phrase that meant nothing. Pending investigation, the manager added quickly, but I assure you this will be handled appropriately. Daniel didn't believe him. Not for a second. Because if he hadn't fought, if he had simply walked off that plane, let the words misunderstanding be the last thing said, nothing would have happened. No one would have been held accountable. No changes would have been made. And another soldier, and another veteran, another service member would have stepped onto a flight just like this one and been treated exactly the same. Daniel took a slow breath, steadying himself. I expect an update, he said, his voice steady, and I expect real action, not just an internal review. The manager hesitated, then nodded. Understood. Daniel didn't thank him. This wasn't something to be grateful for. This was something that should have never happened in the first place. As he finally turned to leave, the weight of everything settled onto his shoulders. But he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over, and he wasn't done fighting. Not for himself, not for the next soldier. Not for anyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or disrespected for no reason other than someone else's arrogance. If you believe Sergeant Hayes deserves real justice, comment it below and show your support. Should the flight attendant be held accountable? What would you have done in his place? Sergeant Daniel Hayes sat motionless in his economy seat, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. His hands, rough and calloused from years of service, gripped the armrests as he stared ahead, his mind racing. He had been trained for combat, for high-pressure situations where seconds meant survival, but nothing had prepared him for the quiet humiliation of being told, without hesitation, without reason, that he didn't belong, that he wasn't worthy of the seat he had rightfully earned. First class had been nearly empty. He had seen the vacant seats. And yet, the flight attendant's cold, unwavering voice had left no room for argument. Move to the back, she had said. This seat is not available for you. Daniel had swallowed his frustration at first, choosing diplomacy, choosing patience. But every second that passed, every minute that he sat there fuming, made it clearer. This was not just a mistake. This was not a logistical error. This was a decision, a deliberate one. And that, more than anything, fueled the fire raging inside of him. The murmurs of other passengers had died down, but their eyes still flickered toward him. Some had seen what happened. Some had even whispered amongst themselves, casting sideways glances at the flight attendant, who now busied herself near the front of the cabin, acting as if nothing had happened. Daniel wasn't the type to make a scene. He had spent his career keeping his emotions in check, handling difficult situations with composure. But this wasn't the battlefield. This wasn't about war or strategy. This was about respect, and he refused to let this slide. With a slow, controlled inhale, Daniel rose from his seat. The cabin wasn't silent, but it felt silent. His steps were measured as he moved down the aisle, his eyes locked on the front of the plane. As he approached the flight attendant, her shoulders stiffened, and she turned to face him with an expression that barely concealed her irritation. Sir, I already told you, I want to speak to a supervisor, Daniel interrupted, his voice calm but unyielding. She sighed dramatically, as if she were the one being inconvenienced, and turned toward the galley, muttering something under her breath. He didn't care. He wasn't going anywhere. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before a man in a neatly pressed uniform emerged from the cockpit area. His face was neutral, his posture professional, But Daniel had been in enough negotiations to know that this was the moment where things could turn either way. Sergeant Hayes, the supervisor, greeted him, his voice clipped. I understand there's been a misunderstanding. There it was again. That word, misunderstanding. Daniel's nostrils flared slightly, but he kept his voice level. No, there hasn't. Your flight attendant refused to let me sit in the first-class seat that I was assigned. I had a valid ticket. She never checked, never verified, just dismissed me. And when I asked for a manager, she refused. The supervisor glanced at the flight attendant, who now stood rigidly at attention. Her lips pursed. I see, he said, nodding slightly. We take all passenger concerns seriously, and I will be reviewing this matter internally. Internally. Daniel nearly scoffed. He had heard those words before. He knew exactly what they meant. A report will be filed, some paperwork will get shuffled, and nothing will happen. The injustice of it all threatened to claw its way out of his chest, but he bit it back. I want to know what actions are being taken, he said, his tone unwavering. The supervisor hesitated, and for a moment, Daniel thought he might try to placate him again. But then, she was out of line, a voice cut in. Daniel turned his head to see a woman seated in first class, her sharp eyes locked on the flight attendant. She never checked his ticket, the woman continued. I saw it. He handed it to her, and she turned him away without even looking. Another passenger, a man in a business suit, nodded in agreement. It was blatant, he added. She didn't just make a mistake. She chose to ignore it. The flight attendant's face paled, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Daniel felt the tide turning. The supervisor straightened, his expression shifting as he realized this was no longer just one passenger's complaint. This was an incident, a witnessed one. He turned to the flight attendant. Is this true? The flight attendant's lips parted, as if she wanted to deny it, but under the weight of the passenger's stares, she faltered. I didn't think he was... She stopped herself, swallowing thickly. I made a mistake. Daniel's muscles tensed. That wasn't an apology. That was an excuse. The supervisor's face darkened slightly, but his professionalism remained intact. We will be conducting an official review of your actions, he said, his voice measured. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties for the remainder of this flight. The flight attendant's eyes widened, but the supervisor lifted a hand. Take a seat in the galley. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, passengers whispering to each other in hushed, incredulous tones. Daniel inhaled deeply, his pulse slowing for the first time in what felt like hours. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a start. The supervisor turned back to him, his posture stiff with authority. Sergeant Hayes, I want to formally apologize on behalf of the airline. Daniel studied him carefully. And what about her? He asked, nodding toward the flight attendant. The supervisor hesitated. Then slowly he turned to her. The flight attendant, who had spent the entire flight pretending Daniel was invisible, pretending she had done nothing wrong, swallowed hard. Her eyes flickered to the passenger staring at her, then back to him. I apologize, she mumbled. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough. But Daniel took it for what it was. A forced acknowledgement that she had been wrong. And that was something she had tried so hard to deny him. As he moved back to his rightful seat in first class, a few passengers gave him subtle nods, silent gestures of support. And in that moment, Daniel knew this fight wasn't over. Because if this had happened to him, it had happened to others. And he wasn't about to let it keep happening. If you believe Daniel deserved better, comment below and show your support. Do you think the airline will follow through? What would you have done in his place? James sat in his first-class seat, his body tense despite the resolution he had fought for. He had reclaimed the seat he was entitled to, but the fight was far from over. A hollow victory was no victory at all. Not if the airline thought they could brush this under the rug with a forced apology and a polite smile. He had seen it happen before, corporations making quiet, surface-level corrections while leaving the real issue unaddressed, and he would not let that happen. The supervisor had assured him that an internal review was underway, but James had learned through years of experience that words meant nothing without action. Too many times he had seen soldiers like him disrespected, disregarded, and cast aside as if their service meant nothing once they were out of uniform. It wasn't just about this flight. It was about every military man and woman who had ever been treated like they were less. And James had no intention of walking away without making sure this never happened again. The murmurs of the passengers had died down, but their eyes still held the weight of what they had witnessed. Some looked away when James met their gaze, their discomfort evident. Others, however, gave him small nods, silent gestures of solidarity. Then, as the plane began to descend, a voice cut through the quiet. "I'd like to make a formal statement." The words came from a man 2 rows ahead, a well-dressed businessman, his dark suit impeccable, his expression serious. James turned his head, watching as the man stood up slightly, looking directly at the supervisor. "I saw the whole thing," he continued. "I watched that flight attendant turn Sergeant Hayes away without even checking his ticket. She didn't hesitate. She didn't question. She just dismissed him." A ripple of murmurs spread across the cabin. The supervisor, who had been standing stiffly near the cockpit, straightened, his jaw tightening. "I saw it too," another voice added. This time it was a woman seated across the aisle. She had remained silent through the ordeal, but now she leaned forward with a look of quiet determination. She never even gave him a chance to explain, just waved him off like he was trying to take something that wasn't his. The flight attendant, the woman who had been so sure of herself, so dismissive, so certain that no one would question her, suddenly paled. Passengers were speaking up. Witnesses were coming forward. And now she was no longer in control of the narrative. James could see the shift in her posture, the stiffness, the way her fingers twitched against the hem of her uniform. She wasn't used to being questioned. She wasn't used to being held accountable. But this time she wouldn't be able to walk away without facing the consequences. The supervisor cleared his throat, his professional mask slipping slightly as he looked between the passengers. "I appreciate your input," he said carefully, his voice controlled. "We will be conducting a full review of the situation once we land." That wasn't enough. Not for James, not anymore. "With all due respect," James said, his voice calm but firm, "I don't trust an internal review to fix this." The supervisor looked at him, wary. "Sergeant!" "No," James cut in, shaking his head. "You say this will be handled, but we both know how these things go. A quiet discussion, a slap on the wrist, and by next week, nothing has changed." He exhaled sharply, the weight of years of seeing injustice go unpunished pressing against his chest. "That's not good enough." The supervisor hesitated, but before he could respond, the businessman from before spoke again. "He's right," the man said. "If no one pushes for real consequences, this will keep happening. To him, to others, to anyone who doesn't fit someone's narrow idea of who belongs where." The woman across the aisle nodded. "You need to escalate this." The words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, James saw something flicker in the supervisor's eyes. Hesitation, maybe even reluctance. He wasn't sure if it was fear of corporate backlash or simple exhaustion from being put in the middle of something much bigger than himself. But that wasn't James's problem. The only thing that mattered was making sure this never happened again. As the plane touched down and the wheels met the runway with a sharp jolt, the reality of the situation settled over everyone. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The supervisor turned to James one last time. "I'll be reporting this directly to our corporate office," he said, his voice quieter now, less rehearsed. "We'll be launching an external review with oversight from our customer relations board." That was progress, not a resolution, not yet, but progress. James gave a slow nod, his fists unclenching slightly. "I'll be following up," he said. And he meant it. As the cabin doors opened and passengers began filing out, the businessman gave James a firm nod of respect before gathering his briefcase. The woman who had spoken up smiled at him softly before disappearing into the crowd. The flight attendant, however, remained frozen in place. She didn't look at James, didn't say a word, because she knew. She knew she had lost control of the narrative. And James? James knew he had just set something in motion that wouldn't be stopped. As he stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, his heart still pounded in his chest. The injustice, the anger, the quiet humiliation, it was all still there. But beneath it, beneath the weight of all that frustration, Something else settled into his bones. Purpose, because this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the passengers who had spoken up. It was about every service member who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or treated as though their sacrifice meant nothing. And James would make damn sure that this airline, the world, understood that they deserved better. If you stand with James in his fight for justice, comment below and show your support. What would you have done in his place? Should the airline be held accountable? Let us know your thoughts. James sat in his hotel room, staring at his laptop screen, the glow casting a dim light over his face. He had just received an email from the airline, a formal update regarding the outcome of their investigation. His heart pounded as he read through the words, his breath catching as the final sentence confirmed what he had been fighting for all along. Following a full review, the flight attendant involved in the incident has been terminated, effective immediately. James exhaled slowly, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. He should have felt relief. He had spent weeks pushing for accountability, for real consequences, for someone to finally recognize the injustice of what had happened to him. But as he read the words again, he realized that his emotions were more complicated than he had expected. Yes, this was justice. Yes, the flight attendant had deserved consequences. But the fact that it had taken so much effort, so much persistence to get here only reinforced what he had suspected all along. Without his relentless pursuit of the truth, without the voices of those passengers who had stood up for him, this incident would have been quietly brushed aside, forgotten. And that thought made his stomach turn. James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as the memories of that day on the plane came flooding back. He could still feel the humiliation of being dismissed, of being told he didn't belong. He could still see the condescending expression on that flight attendant's face as she crossed her arms and denied him the seat he had rightfully earned. And now she had lost her job. But James wasn't celebrating. Not yet. A sudden knock at the door made him jolt slightly, pulling him from his thoughts. He stood up and opened it, revealing Mark, one of his closest friends from the military, standing there with a knowing look in his eyes. "You got the email?" Mark asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. James nodded, shutting the door behind him. "Yeah, she's gone." Mark let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Took them long enough." James scoffed. "No kidding." Mark sat down on the couch, studying his friend's face. "You don't look happy." James hesitated. "It's not that I'm not happy. I don't know. It shouldn't have come to this. I shouldn't have had to fight this hard for them to do the right thing." Mark nodded, his expression serious. "You're right, but you did fight, and that fight mattered." James ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "Yeah, I just wonder how many others didn't have the chance to fight back. How many people were treated like that and just accepted it because they didn't have the time or energy to push for justice?" Mark's jaw tightened. "Too many." Silence settled between them for a moment before Mark spoke again. "You know, I looked into her." James blinked. "What?" "The flight attendant. I wanted to see if there was anything about her in the news." Mark pulled out his phone, scrolling. "Turns out this wasn't the first time she's done something like this." James's stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" Mark handed him the phone. "There's a post from a guy a couple of years ago. Said he had a bad experience with her on a flight. Didn't go into details, but it sounded eerily familiar. Like she had a habit of treating certain people like they didn't belong." James stared at the screen, his fingers tightening around the device. So she had done this before, and no one had stopped her. His blood ran cold at the realization. If he hadn't fought back, if he hadn't forced the airline to take action, she would have kept doing it. How many passengers had suffered under her unchecked arrogance? How many people had been pushed aside, ignored, disrespected, just because she had the power to do so? That thought made his stomach churn. James wasn't a vengeful person. He had never taken pleasure in someone else's downfall. But this wasn't just about a single employee making a mistake. This was about a pattern of behavior that had gone unchallenged for far too long. He handed the phone back to Mark. "She got what she deserved." Mark nodded. "Yeah, and you made sure of it." James sighed, running a hand over his face. "I just wish I didn't have to." Mark clapped a hand on his shoulder. "But you did. And because of you, this airline had to take a long, hard look at how they treat their passengers. That's a win, man. James wanted to believe that. And maybe, just maybe, he did. James was getting ready to check out of his hotel when his phone buzzed again. Another email. This time it was from the airline's customer relations team. He skimmed the contents quickly, his heart pounding as he realized what he was reading. They weren't just terminating the flight attendant, they were overhauling their military appreciation program. The email detailed new policies they were implementing, including better training for their employees, clear procedures to prevent discrimination, and a direct customer support line specifically for military personnel who encountered issues while flying. And at the very bottom of the email, there was a request. We would like to invite you to be part of a discussion panel to help us implement these changes and ensure that our policies truly reflect the respect and gratitude we owe to our service members. James swallowed hard. They were asking him to help make the system better. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at the screen, letting the weight of it sink in. He had started this fight for himself. But now he had a chance to make sure that no one else had to go through what he did. He took a deep breath, his chest tightening with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not just in himself, but in the fact that he had forced a massive company to acknowledge their flaws and fix them. He sat down on the bed, staring at the email for another moment before finally typing his response. I'd be honored to help. When he hit send, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just a personal victory anymore. This was a movement, and he had led it. James sat in the conference room, his fingers interlocked, his heartbeat steady but strong. The table before him was lined with executives, their polished suits and carefully composed expressions giving away nothing. The CEO sat at the head of the table, her hands folded neatly as she spoke. We want to make sure what happened to you never happens again, she said, her voice smooth, professional. And we're prepared to make changes. James had waited weeks for this moment. He had fought for it, pushed for it, forced the airline to take responsibility when they had initially tried to brush his experience aside. But now, sitting in this room with all eyes on him, he realized that this wasn't just about what had happened to him. This was about every service member who had ever felt disrespected, every veteran who had boarded a plane and been made to feel like they didn't belong. Every soldier who had quietly swallowed the injustice because they believed no one would listen. But today, James wasn't here to be ignored. He leaned forward, his voice firm, his presence unshakable. Good, he said, because I didn't go through all of this just to hear empty promises. The CEO's lips pressed together and a few of the executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. We understand, she replied carefully, and that's why we're implementing real institutional changes. James listened as they outlined their plans. A new military support system, a direct priority access customer service line specifically for military personnel and veterans to ensure their concerns were heard and addressed immediately. Mandatory staff training, a complete overhaul of employee training, ensuring that every flight attendant, gate agent, and customer service representative understood how to treat military members with dignity and respect. Policy revisions. A clearly outlined, non-negotiable policy for handling military upgrades. So what happened to James could never be dismissed as a miscommunication again. Public acknowledgement. A statement from the airline recognizing their mistake and reaffirming their commitment to honoring and respecting those who serve. James nodded slowly, taking it all in. It was more than he had expected. It was more than just lip service, but he wasn't about to let them off the hook just yet. That's a start, he said, his voice steady but firm. But words mean nothing without action. The CEO tilted her head, as if silently inviting him to continue. I want to know how you plan to enforce this, James continued. How do you make sure that these aren't just policies on paper, but something every single employee understands and follows? One of the executives cleared his throat. We're working with military organizations to develop the training. We'll also be holding workshops to educate our employees. No, James cut in, not just education, accountability. Silence fell over the room. You can train people all you want, he continued, but unless there's real accountability, unless there are real consequences for those who fail to show respect, This will just be another corporate PR stunt. The CEO held his gaze. What do you suggest? James took a deep breath. A zero-tolerance policy, he said. If an employee disrespects a service member or ignores these policies, there needs to be immediate disciplinary action. Not a slap on the wrist, not a coaching session, a real consequence. The executives exchanged glances. James wasn't naive. He knew they didn't like being told how to run their company, but he also knew that he wasn't here to make them comfortable. He was here to make sure they actually did something. The CEO finally nodded. We can include that in the enforcement of the policy, she said. We'll develop a review system for reported incidents, and if an employee violates our new military respect standards, there will be real consequences. James exhaled. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, and something was better than nothing. He stood up, placing his hands on the table. Then I expect you to follow through. The CEO stood as well, offering her hand. We will. James hesitated for a moment before shaking it. I'll be watching. As he left the conference room, he felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The humiliation, the frustration, the fight. It had all been worth it, because change was coming, and he had made sure of it. Later that week, the airline made their official announcement. They released a statement acknowledging their failure to properly honor and respect service members. They admitted that they had mishandled James's situation and announced the launch of their military respect initiative, outlining the new policies they had developed with his input. The public reaction was immediate. Social media exploded with discussions, with people sharing their own experiences, both good and bad, when it came to airlines and their treatment of military personnel. Veterans commented, thanking James for standing up and pushing for change. Service members from around the world voiced their support, sharing how often they had felt overlooked or dismissed. And for the first time, James realized just how many people had been affected by this issue. This wasn't just his fight. It had never been just his fight. James didn't ask for this battle, but he fought it anyway. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. And now it's your turn to show your support. If you believe that every soldier, every veteran, and every service member deserves respect, hit the like button to stand with James. If you believe that companies should be held accountable for how they treat people, comment below and let us know what you think of these changes. And most importantly, share this story to spread the message. James proved that one voice can make a difference. Now let's make sure that message is heard loud and clear. Respect is not a privilege, it's a right. And it's time the world finally understood that. James Carter never set out to change the world. He never expected to be the face of a movement, a voice that would ignite a conversation across industries, across borders, across lives. All he had wanted was simple, to be treated with the same respect he had fought to protect, to sit in the seat he had rightfully earned without being made to feel like he was undeserving. But now, standing in front of a packed auditorium at a Veterans Appreciation event, he saw just how far the ripples of his actions had spread. The airline had made its changes, yes. Policies were rewritten, training programs were reinforced, and accountability was finally put into place. But what James had never anticipated was that this fight, the fight for dignity, for fairness, would become so much bigger than just one company, because people had been watching. And now they were listening. It started with a few emails, messages from veterans, active duty service members, and even civilians who had followed James's story. They shared their own experiences, their own moments of being dismissed, overlooked, or disrespected simply because someone had assumed they didn't belong. Then came the news stories. Major outlets picked up the story, discussing not just what had happened to James, but the broader issue of how military personnel were treated in everyday life. The conversation wasn't just about one airline anymore. It was about every company, every public service, every place where a uniform was met with indifference instead of gratitude. And then, something incredible happened. Other companies began to take notice. A major hotel chain announced new policies ensuring military guests would receive priority check-in and upgraded accommodations whenever available. A nationwide restaurant franchise rolled out a permanent discount program for veterans, not as a promotion, but as a long-term commitment. Even retail corporations started implementing customer service training, That included recognizing and respecting military personnel, making sure no service member would ever be treated as an afterthought again. It was no longer just about James, it was about all of them, the soldiers, the veterans, the families who had waited for them to come home. It was about a culture shift, and James had been the spark. Months after the airline had issued their public commitment to change, James received a call from a corporate executive at a well-known multinational business. "We'd like to invite you to be part of a leadership panel," the voice on the other end said. "We're assembling a team to help companies implement stronger military appreciation initiatives. Your insight could help shape policies across multiple industries." James was speechless. In all his years of service, he had been trained to fight battles, to protect, to defend. He had never imagined that his most significant battle would be fought with his words, his principles, his refusal to back down. And now he was being asked to help change the system from the inside out. He said yes, not for himself, but for every soldier who had ever felt invisible in the country they had sworn to protect. Not long after, he found himself in a high-rise conference room, sitting across from executives of some of the biggest brands in the country. These weren't just airline executives. They were CEOs of tech companies, restaurant chains, hotel groups, and more. All of them had gathered for one reason: because James Carter had made them pay attention. The discussion was intense but productive. Companies asked questions, they listened, they took notes. And by the end of the meeting, it was clear that this was more than just a moment. It was a movement toward respect, toward gratitude, toward finally recognizing that the people who sacrificed so much for their country shouldn't have to fight for basic dignity when they returned home. Months later, James was back at the airport, the same airport where everything had begun. Only this time, things felt different. As he walked toward his gate, he noticed something: flight attendants greeting soldiers warmly, offering them priority boarding without hesitation. Gate agents thanking veterans as they handed them their tickets. Fellow passengers nodding in quiet respect as uniformed service members made their way through the terminal. It wasn't just policy that had changed, it was people. James felt something deep in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not pride in himself, but in what they had accomplished together. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a new standard. And for the first time in a long time, he knew his fight had been worth it. James's journey wasn't just about a first-class seat. It was about something much bigger. Respect is not optional. It doesn't matter where you come from, what uniform you wear, or what role you play in society. Every single person deserves to be treated with dignity. One voice can make a difference. James could have walked away. He could have let the airline dismiss him. But because he stood up, he didn't just change his own experience. He changed the experience of thousands of others. The fight for fairness is never over. James's battle may have ended with one airline, but the movement continues. There are still places, still companies, still people who need to be reminded that kindness and respect should always come first. And that's where you come in. James fought for respect. Now it's your turn to keep that fight going. Comment below if you believe that every soldier and veteran deserves respect. Let's show our support. Like this story if you believe that one voice can make a difference. Subscribe to our channel to hear more powerful stories like this. Stories of courage, of standing up for what's right, of people who refuse to back down when it matters most. This story isn't just about James anymore. It's about all of us. Let's make sure the world knows. Respect is a right. Dignity is non-negotiable. And those who serve should never be made to feel like they don't belong. This is just the beginning, and together, we can change the world.